We have with us today Dr. Agnes Quisumbing, a person perhaps most suited for a discussion on the WEAI, as she is among the pioneers of the index, along with her colleagues Ruth Meisendick, Dr. Amber Peterman, Sabina Al-Khair, and others. She's an economist and a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She has worked extensively on topics including poverty, intra-household allocation of resources, property rights, and of course, the empowerment of women in very different contexts in the global south. So South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and she's joining us from the US. She hails originally from the Philippines. Thank you, Dr. Agnes. And since we had this, like rare opportunity of having her, we didn't want this to be just a lecture, but a discussion, because we have, some questions. And to articulate those questions from our side, we have three panelists from ZEFb, Dr. Denise Irahola, Subash Surendran Padmaja, sorry if I did not say your name, last name correctly, and Dr. Tina Beuchelt. We all are familiar with our colleagues, but for you, Dr. Agnes, I'd give their brief introductions. Dr. Denise is an academic on gender and development studies with experience of working as a development consultant, particularly in Latin America. She was born in Bolivia, has worked with the indigenous communities in the rural areas, and was part of the women's organizations in the urban context. Currently, she's a senior researcher at ZEFb and also the co-coordinator of the ZEFb gender group. Subash is a junior researcher at ZEFb. He's also a scientist with the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, the ICAR. Prior to it, he was working with the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMIT. He has undertaken research across South and Southeast Asia, focusing on technology adoption and impact assessment of self-help groups and other community-based development programs. Dr. Tina Beuchelt is a senior researcher and also a co-coordinator of the ZEFb gender group. Her research themes encompass sustainable land use, food security, gender, and human rights. She's conducted research on gender in agriculture in a variety of contexts, just like yourself, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and part of it at the International Agricultural Research Center. At ZEFb, she offers courses on gender, environment, and sustainable development, and designed and leads several gender-sensitive and gender-responsive projects on agriculture and sustainable land use. Before we begin, I'd like to ask Dr. Matin Qaim, the Director of the Department of Economic and Technological Change here at ZEFb, to give his opening remarks and to welcome our guest.
Good afternoon or good morning at your end, Agnes. I'm not sure whether you can see us here in the room. I'm not online. I'm sitting here in presence together with around 25 other persons from ZEFb. So good attendance, same number online as you're finding here in the room. We're extremely happy to have you here for the seminar. We would have loved to have you in presence, but virtually is certainly fine. I wanted to share with you how I got first encounters with your work, because that was back in my own studies of agricultural development at the University of Kiel, when my professor of food security at that time, Joachim von Braun, was using some of your seminal papers already at that time on women in agriculture. And I was really heavily influenced by this. I remember one of the papers, I think it was an overview paper that was titled "Women Key to Food Security." which summarized some of the important mechanisms of how women's empowerment can improve resource use efficiency and food security, really through various pathways. And that paper influenced my own thinking, and it influenced the thinking of subsequent generations. I've been using this paper and a few others of your work in my own classes, and obviously that's just that narrow field that I'm overseeing, but obviously people around the world are using your important insights. You were one of the pioneers of working on gender and agricultural development 30 years back. It wasn't at all mainstream. It was, few people working on that. It became more popular in the sense that more people are now working on it, and it's good that in the research community we see gender research as something that's becoming much more common. But we also know that much still needs to be done. I mean, just talking about gender equality obviously is not enough. We really need to better understand what the constraints are and how these can be removed to really move towards gender equality in development, because this is so important not only from an equity perspective, but also from an economic growth and development perspective more broadly. You continue to be a world-leading scholar in this important field, and you're a role model for so many young researchers, including here at ZEFb and elsewhere. So we're happy you're still doing seminal work empirically and conceptually, and you were one of the pioneers developing the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. So now that this has been used for 10 years around the world, we're looking forward to your insights on how it has been used, how it has been useful, and perhaps how it can and needs to be further developed along that important line of research. Thanks for being with us. We're very proud and look forward to your talk, Agnes.
Thank you, Dr. Qaim. Before handing the floor to Dr. Agnes, I would like to let the audience joining us online know that they can ask their questions using the chat function. Our colleague Hinamber is collecting these questions, and we'll later ask these from you. So now, Dr. Agnes, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Matin, for the very kind preface. Thank you to the Center for Development Research for inviting me to give this lecture. Yes, it's been 10 years since the WEAI was started, and you will see in my brief overview talk or in my presentation how much of it has grown. And just as a sneak peek, you will also see later on how your German colleagues have really catalyzed the development of some versions of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, particularly to address issues of market inclusion. So we will see this in a bit. Next slide, please. So just as a brief overview, and this might be a review for some and an introduction for others, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or the WEAI, was developed by USAID, IFPRI, and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative in 2012 to measure the inclusion of women in the agricultural sector. So unlike other measures of gender equality, it is survey-based, so it's not built up from aggregate statistics. It interviews men and women in the same household, and is designed to look at decision-making and control over livelihoods, resources, and income, both sole and joint, mostly in agriculture, and was designed for population-based surveys. So this initial version was used to track progress in the US Feed the Future initiative. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay. So the WEAI is made up of two sub-indices. One measures empowerment in the 5 domains of empowerment, and it's a direct measure of women's or men's empowerment in 5 dimensions. And the other part of it is the Gender Parity Index, which assesses women's achievements relative to the primary male in the household. The weights given are 0.9 to the 5DE and 0.1 to the GPI, and all range from 0 to 1, with higher values meaning greater empowerment. Please advance the slides. So the original WEAI consisted of 5 domains: production, resources, income, leadership, and time, and 10 indicators. Now, in the process of rolling these out, users found that it was too long. And in particular, some of the modules were a bit difficult to administer in the field. So for example, one of the indicators for community leadership was speaking out in public. And in some contexts where, for example, there was a lot of political unrest, this was actually an indicator which was difficult to collect. So in creating the abbreviated WEAI, we still have the same 5 domains, but only 6 indicators that remain, and input in production of decisions, ownership of assets, access to and decision on credit, control over the use of income, group membership, and workload. Next slide, please. Now, what happened quite interestingly is that a lot of civil society organizations started using the WEAI. And what they found was that some of the domains and some of the indicators didn't truly reflect what they thought were essential for project success. So with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USAID, and the then CGI Research Program on Agriculture for Nutrition and Health, we worked with 13 agricultural development projects to develop a project level WEAI. And you will see here that the domains are actually different from the original WEAI, although the indicators still have a mapping. This is now more in line with theories of agency, where we look at intrinsic agency or power within, instrumental agency or power to, and collective agency or power with. And our intrinsic agency indicators are autonomy in income decisions, self-efficacy, attitudes towards intimate partner violence against women. The instrumental agency indicators include input into production decisions, ownership of land and other assets, control over the use of income, access to and decisions of financial services, work balance, and visiting important locations. And we have an indicator on collective agency, which is group membership. This draws on qualitative research and testing quantitative instruments. There are also optional add-ons for nutrition and livestock-oriented projects. And we have tailored and reoriented this for projects focusing on market inclusion, not only primary production. So may I have the next slide, please? So if you look at how the WEAI sort of fits into a scheme of indicators, it's actually a WEAI family of indicators. There's the original WEAI, 5 domains, 10 indicators. There's the A WEAI, which is 5 domains, 6 indicators. The Core Pro WEAI originally was 3 domains, 12 indicators, and this is now gone down to 10 indicators. And then we have these optional add-on modules which focus on health and nutrition, livestock, and market inclusion. Sort of in parallel, IFPRI created an iWEAI or integrated WEAI, where they sort of merged the WEAI questions into their existing large-scale survey so that you don't have to ask the same questions twice. And then also we are developing a women's empowerment metric for national statistical systems. And I'll talk about women's later on. Next slide, please. So in 2011, we began piloting the WEAI in 3 countries, and it was used by 4 organizations. Next slide. In 2012, it was launched in the Feed the Future initiative countries, covering 21 countries and used by 4 organizations. Next slide, we fast forward to 2022, when WEAI is now 10 years old. There are 58 countries where it's been used, and it's been used by 232 organizations. So happy birthday, WEAI. It's been quite a decade for us. So let's take a look at what we have learned. Okay, next slide, please. So as WEAI has been changing, the world has been changing too. The world for women and girls has been changing whereas climate change has been going on and affecting everybody. And as this world changes for women and girls, we see increased market orientation. We see an increase in rural non-farm enterprises. We see increases in non-agricultural employment, and we also see migration and urbanization. And not to mention, there is conflict going on, prices are increasing. I mean, this is a very turbulent world. So we ask, are the domains in which we're measuring empowerment still relevant? Next slide, please. So one of the areas that's relatively new in the development of WEAI is a pro-WEAI for market inclusion. And this is one of the projects in which we've been quite privileged to work with some GIZ-funded projects and NEPAD in Malawi and Benin. So the pro-WEAI for market inclusion tracks empowerment across multiple nodes of the value chain. So it consists of the core pro-WEAI module and new complementary indicators to investigate barriers to market access and inclusion for different value chain actors. So you have the core pro-WEAI module, the circle, and then this dashboard of indicators in blue below. This is validated using cognitive interviewing and qualitative work. And it enhances the ability to measure and contextualize empowerment and inclusion across value chains. So the previous versions of the WEAI have been very production oriented. And what we want to do now is sort of to move it to look at things that are happening across the markets. Next slide, please. So for example, two of the new indicators in the dashboard are an entrepreneurial mindset and input and decisions in the main value chain. And these are interviews from with women themselves as we were doing our work in the area. So for entrepreneurial mindset, this woman in Malawi has, talks about women realizing that business is a way of life. And in Bangladesh, we have a woman who is saying that she's capable of making decisions in the main value chain of farming, going to the market to shop, getting a loan myself. So she does everything in her own will. So this is really quite, I think, important to be able to hear the voices of the women themselves. Next slide, please. So just keep advancing. So we're now going to look at lessons from a decade of WEAI. So keep advancing, please. More. And one more. So we've now used WEAI in its variations for 10 years. And so what have we learned from measuring empowerment? We learned that it's very important to use mixed methods. The WEAI drew on life histories and case studies, and pro-WEAI has qualitative protocols that inform the choice of indicators and interpretation of results. So it's really quite important to listen to people's own understandings of empowerment. And context is very important on its own, and also to interpret quantitative findings. So there is a set of qualitative protocols that you can download from the WEAI Resource Center together with the other files to compute the WEAI. Okay, next slide, please. We've also found out that having a standardized measure of women's empowerment enables us to examine better what are the gains to empowering women. So for example, lower empowerment gaps between spouses is associated with higher technical efficiency in agricultural production in Bangladesh. It's associated with higher production diversity and calorie availability in Bangladesh and better iron status for women in India. It's positively associated with her own dietary diversity score in Kenya, and also enhances the positive nutrition effect of a system of organic pest control. Next slide, please. But I think it's also important to pay attention to the trade-offs that also exist. So for example, we did a study of 6 countries: Bangladesh, Nepal, Cambodia, Malawi, Ghana, and Mozambique. Tanzania, Mozambique, and Ghana. And in these 6 countries, we found that women's empowerment score was positively associated only with the children's long-term nutritional status. and not necessarily her own nutritional status. Greater equality within the household was associated with a higher likelihood of exclusive breastfeeding and children's long-term nutritional status, but lower women's BMI. So as we look at, the nice thing about the WEAI is that it's made up of separate indicators which you can sort of disaggregate and unpack to look at specific impacts. And unpacking these results suggests that there are trade-offs with women's time use and own nutritional status. So women who are more involved in agriculture, who may appear to be more empowered in terms of production decisions, control over the use of income, for example, may end up having higher workload or worse work balance, and may be working harder physically, which leads to a lower BMI. And these are the population that we were studying are low BMI populations where the incidence of overweight and obesity isn't that high. So we're looking at relatively, on the low macronutrient and micronutrient intake scale. So these trade-offs are indeed quite important to pay attention to. Next slide, please. One thing we also looked at was whether agricultural development projects can empower women. And what we found that even if projects have empowerment objectives, many projects do not achieve significant impacts on empowerment indicators. There's some correspondence between the types of strategies that have impact, but it's not exact. So strategies that increase respect within the household for women and achieving work balance for both men and women may be effective. But some strategies may backfire in the sense that a lot of these only try to reach women, and they may end up reducing men's participation in groups. We're also finding that regional effects are important, and so are underlying gender norms. Next slide, please. There have, however, been projects which are successful, and the successful projects are those which are intentional. They recognize that you need to take specific steps if you want to achieve empowerment and gender equality. They try to address underlying gender norms. They often work through women's groups, but they don't forget that you have to involve men and influential household and community members as part of the solution. You really can't solve gender inequality by working only with women. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that we were also working towards a women's empowerment metric for national statistical systems. And part of this is because the WEAI instrument is actually quite long to administer, and we wanted to develop a shorter instrument that can be used in nationally representative surveys. So we're working with the World Bank, LSMS, and Emory University in the context of the 50 by 2030 initiative to do this. We're linking women's empowerment to agricultural and development data, like M&E indicators for agricultural development projects. We're hoping to provide benchmarking for projects. And our candidate questions were inspired by SDG 5, Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality, and other relevant SDGs. We've completed the stakeholder consultations. We've done 2 rounds of phone surveys, and we are preparing to have face-to-face surveys to launch in 2023. We had intended to do face-to-face surveys earlier, but because of COVID, they shifted to phone surveys. We expect that women's will build on lessons from WEAI, but will look quite different. So my last slide, well, my second to the last slide, next slide, please. So we have a very large cast of characters to thank. I mean, this is only part of the team that developed for WEAI. And finally, in the next slide, and if you want to look at the resources for WEAI, please go to the IFPRI WEAI Resource Center. You can download new files, modules, data. And we also have a distance learning course, which is available and it is free. So there is one in English, there's one in French, and there is more to come. So thank you so much for listening to me sort of reminisce about the past 10 years of WEAI, and I look forward to the comments and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agnes, for that overview. It certainly already answers quite a few of our questions, but I'd still like to invite our panelists, Dr. Denise, Dr. Tina, and Subash, to ask their questions. Denise, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Sundus, and thank you very much, Dr. Quisumbing, for this very clear presentation, and congratulations, of course, on the 10 years anniversary of the WEAI. This panel, I think, is a great opportunity to expand more on what you have already mentioned. My first question is very general on the application and impacts of the use of the index so far in these 10 years. No? So we know you also have told us today again that the index started as a tool useful for performance monitoring and impact evaluations, and now I learned in previous presentations of yours that it has been, or it is being used for more than 200 organizations in more than 50 countries currently, no? That's quite impressive. So by policymakers and development organizations aiming at creating enabling conditions for women's empowerment. However, empowerment is a term that, of course, was coined by feminist and women's movements to achieve short and long-term objectives. Basically, we know to challenge patriarchal systems, no, reflected in socioeconomic and political inequalities. We know in the 80s, to talk about empowerment was to talk about disruptive and subversive, a subversive term. No? So my question here, sorry, I extended this introduction too much. My question is if you could give us a very specific example on in which this index has been used to bring about strategic transformation, long-term transformation. What was required to make the use of this index functional to a deep transformation in a long term? Please.
So should I answer it now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the example I'm going to give is an example from Bangladesh. And it's actually, I think, a testimony to how we have been able to engage with the government of Bangladesh in using these data to design a program which has the potential to be scaled up and also to bring about long-term change. So Bangladesh was one of the first countries to implement the WEAI in a nationally representative survey, the Bangladesh Integrated Household Survey, which is, by the way, also publicly available. And what happened when, as we started using the BIHS, was that we noticed that there were very close links between women's empowerment, dietary diversity, and agricultural production diversity. And these were, correlational things. We noticed that households where women were more empowered had higher production diversity. They also had greater dietary diversity. And this really sort of drew attention to the linkages between gender, agriculture, and nutrition. So we worked with the Ministry of Agriculture in Bangladesh to design a pilot study which randomized the provision of agricultural extension, nutrition, behavior change communication, and gender sensitization training, to farm households. And these, the treatment arms were designed to be additive, so you could test, which treatment was most successful. The interesting thing that we found out was that all the treatment arms actually ended up empowering women. The treatment arm with nutrition had a positive impact on men's empowerment, and also there were improvements in gender equality. But as we sort of unpack this even further, what is very interesting was that it was really the provision of these trainings, in agriculture and nutrition and in gender sensitization to men and women together that was quite transformative, because it gave men and women a space to interact. It gave them a chance where women could learn and sort of be respected for their knowledge. It gave them a chance to make decisions together. And as a result of the success of this program, this is now going to be scaled up nationwide. So when we looked at sort of indicators of gender attitudes, we do see that there have been changes, some changes in gender norms. Now, I will admit that gender norms are really, really quite slow to change. I mean, even in our other programs that we have evaluated, we see impacts on the instrumental agency indicators much more quickly than we see impact on the intrinsic agency indicators. So it's, I would say that it's a long struggle. The other area where I think you might be interested in an impact, and we don't know, we still don't know whether it's going to persist in the long run, is that one of our projects in Tanzania noticed that there was an area of disempowerment was this attitudes towards intimate partner violence towards women. It was not in their current project, but because they realized using the ProWEAI it was a problem, their next round of projects now includes things to address this issue. So I think the change is probably going to be incremental if you're realistic about it. But I think we should not underestimate the changes that are going on within women themselves, because the qualitative work that was undertaken within, especially the project that developed ProWEAI, which is GAP, the Gender Agriculture and Assets Project Phase 2 or GAP 2, really has voices of the women and men themselves talking about how the program has changed their lives. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tina, do you want to?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dr. Quisumbing, for your excellent presentation and all the critical reflections also you made on the WEAI. I think the WEAI and its various versions are really absolutely great and a timely innovation in the development community and a great tool for monitoring and evaluation. I would have many questions because I think it's really an exciting tool, but I concentrate maybe on one. You just tackled a little bit, and probably from the question you can see I'm a big fan of rather qualitative research, though I do quantitative research as well. I know from my work at CIMA that development organizations, donors, really prioritize very clearly the quantitative measurement of impacts and clear indicators. And I guess that's why the WEAI was set up the way it was set up. But I'm wondering how we can more incorporate maybe gender relations and power differentials, and including the different norms in the communities, because they are very difficult to be summed up in a single index or many numbers. And the ProWEAI is influenced already, as I saw from going through it, by the qualitative research, but it's an index in the end. So I was wondering, two questions actually, how we on the one hand can address the perceptions of the donors and the development community to, in addition maybe to the index, complemented by a qualitative assessment. And if you have thought about it, to maybe in addition to the index you're reporting in, to include also a qualitative reporting module, like a standardized qualitative maybe questionnaire with standardized then analysis, so that we have the index and then maybe a qualitative based reporting in addition that includes, for example, gender power relations and aspirations of women. Thank you.
Great, thank you for these questions. Yeah, it's quite interesting that there's this perception that the WEAI suite of instruments is primarily quantitative. There is actually a set of qualitative protocols that were developed as the ProWEAI was being developed, because we needed to make sure that the indicators really reflected what people themselves thought of empowerment. So one of the things, for example, that came out from the qualitative work was that the idea of power over, which is one of the domains of agency, coercive agency in the schema of Joe Rowlands was not something that people liked. They didn't think of it as a good thing. So this is one reason why that didn't make it into ProWEA. So there is indeed a set of qualitative protocols, and we always encourage the people who use ProWEA or any of the WEAs to do qualitative work as well, because sometimes some of the results really cannot be understood unless you contextualize them. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. So we were involved in doing a synthesis across impact evaluations of the UN Joint Program for Rural Women's Economic Empowerment, JPRUE. And one of the countries was Nepal, where it appeared that men were becoming disempowered because their workload was increasing. Of course, everybody's workload was high. But when we talked to the program staff, well, they said that men's workload is increasing because they are taking on more of women's reproductive labor. They're helping with childcare, they're helping with housework. I mean, isn't that fantastic? But why is it being looked at as disempowering? I mean, so there's, in a sense, you're looking at gender norms changing. Should that be viewed as disempowering? I don't think so. But it's one of those things that if you just look at the numbers, you're not going to understand what's actually really going on. So in response to your second question about including a standardized qualitative reporting framework, whatever. So we do have these protocols that we recommend. However, I'm also of the mind that a lot of qualitative work is very serendipitous, and it may be constraining and to sort of force people to think inside a box. So the protocols are there for researchers to use and to adapt as needed to the context. But we certainly recommend that people use mixed methods in using ProWEA or any of the WEAs for that matter. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Agnes Quisumbing, for your presentation. I'm one of the users of WEAI, and I have extensively used it in my research, and I appreciate you and your colleagues' efforts in developing it and disseminating it using various training programs and open resources. I would like to bring 2 points for discussion. First is on a point which previously Dennis and Tina mentioned regarding the role of gender norms. The underlying social and gender norms reinforces women's subordination and continue to disempower them. The question is like how it can be integrated more into the analysis using WEAI or ProWEAI. This concern actually stems from my own experience in the field in which I have observed that women empowered in those dimensions of WEAI but continue to battle against the societal gender norms. So my question is specifically on the qualitative aspects which are measured using the vignettes in the ProWEAI capturing the societal gender norms. I have another question too, which is very much specific to the index as such. Thing which I have faced and most of our researchers have faced is the calculation of index itself is a bit fairly complex, given that it is data intensive, as you had mentioned, and requires data preparation and calculation using some softwares. Given that the codes provided in the resource material is Stata, and what has been your experience so far concerning its use and implementation capacity in developing countries? What I'm referring to is beyond international research organizations. Are there any thoughts in developing the model codes in open access softwares? Also, now as you had mentioned, there is an effort to look into women empowerment metrics in national statistical systems. Are they considering how they are, you said it will be different from WEAI. Could you also provide some insights on how different it would be? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for these questions. Your first question actually reminded me of one of Tina's questions, which I forgot to answer. It's your question, the role of gender norms also sort of goes back to the role of the community. And I think that the existing WEAI or the versions of the WEAI don't do that well in capturing empowerment beyond the household and the individual. So my colleagues, Ruth Meinzendick, whom many of you know, is working with as part of the IFPRI project that developed by WEAI. They're also developing measures of collective agency, which are more grounded in sort of group experience and community experience. So, keep posted for that work. I'm not involved in that work, but that's going to be some instruments that should be coming out soon. I believe there may actually be a working paper by Sarah Eisler, which already addresses measures of, I'm not sure whether it's a collective agency or time agency, but those two are currently being developed. So how do you integrate gender norms more in the analysis? As everyone knows, gender norms are very context specific, and in developing the WEAI instruments, we wanted to come up with something that could be used across a portfolio. So in some sense, it's a blunt instrument because we wanted to have some comparability, which is why I think it's really important to have the qualitative work for contextualization. So you will see, you can use WEAI to diagnose areas of disempowerment. And I think that that's actually already quite revealing of what some of the gender norms are. For example, if you observe that, because you collect the WEAI for men and women, and so if you observe, for example, that there are very large disparities, for example, in time use, I think that reflects a certain gender norm about women being caregivers, for example. If you see disparities in control over resources or ownership of assets, that already reveals it reveals the gender norm about women not necessarily being considered fit or right to own assets. So I may not have stressed this enough, but all the WEAI indices are decomposable indices. So they're like the Alkire-Foster indices. They're very similar to the poverty gap measures. So because you can decompose them, you can identify what is the area of disempowerment that you can target. And if you look at how you map how men's disempowerment looks compared to women's disempowerment, you really see sort of some manifestation of gender norms. That said, it's really important to have the qualitative work to help you understand the context where all of this is playing out. So the vignettes that we use and which you mentioned, actually, we started using vignettes because the original versions of the WEAI had questions that were very abstract and they didn't work that well. They were questions that were sort of developed in the context of psychological testing, and they didn't relate that well to people's experiences. And we actually use a vignette selectively in areas of the questionnaire which are sort of difficult to ask in a standard asset listing format or something like that. Okay, about the index being very data intensive. So the data collection itself is very data intensive, that we know, and that's also part of the reason why we're trying to streamline. There are efforts to streamline the indicators. The code, unfortunately, is still written in Stata, even though the code is free and downloadable from our website. We're hoping that somebody will program it in R or something like that. I think there are some efforts by some people to do that. And if you have them, please share them with us. We would love to have an open access version on our website as well. How different is women's going to be? That's still something that is to be determined because it's still under development. So just, be patient and you'll see it next year. Okay, that's all.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just like to add what I shared with my colleagues when we were talking about this, that the university in Pakistan that I went to, it was a fairly decent university, but we did not have access to Stata. And our professor would draw the interface on the board for us just to show us how it works. So, that gives that obviously, just gives a sense of the gaps in terms of the implementation of several things that, sometimes we take for granted, but it's not directly, applicable in other contexts. I have a question before, we go into a second round. And it relates to what you said about, it's great that it's based on the comparison of data that we collect for both men and women. But I was wondering, what do you suggest that how can how can we take into account the disempowerment that both men and women experience in context of poverty, deprivation, or in institutional arrangements that do not serve them? I mean, I'm referring to, this claim that often, feminists from the global south make that, we want equality, but equality with whom? With men who themselves are so disempowered due to regional, national, and global structures. How do you suggest that can somehow be incorporated when you're using the empowerment index, which either are based on WEAI or using WEAI itself?
So we usually recommend that when you collect the WEAI, you don't collect it in isolation from other information about the household, right? So it's usually embedded in a household questionnaire, so we can understand, and which collects things about assets and education and all that. So then you can examine how, for example, how poverty can also be a constraint to empowerment. So in fact, one of the questions that we have always wanted to ask is whether it is poverty or patriarchy, which is a greater barrier to empowerment. And I think that for very poor people, it may be poverty that is the barrier. So it's something that we need to pay attention to.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to open the floor for the audience here. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Moment. Aisha?
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Aisha and I'm an anthropologist. I've worked extensively in rural areas of Pakistan. I just wanted to know, is the index has any element of property ownership? Because I think so from the socio-cultural norms and particularly when to talk about contextualization from region to region, how does property ownership, particularly the agricultural land and ownership of women, can play a role in this women empowerment, and how does index has this reflection of women's property ownership? I think so it would be very important, particularly when we talk about women's empowerment in agricultural index.
So if you look at the indicators that make up the index, one of the core indicators in the resources domain is ownership of land and other assets. So that is the indicator that captures property ownership. That is collected for both women and men as well. So you can see gender disparities there. I don't know whether that answered your question.
Yes, I was just wondering if it is part of the index. Maybe I have missed it.
Yes, it is part of the index.
We'll go back to some more questions that the panel had. So Denise, do you want to start the second round?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, in the talks, the preparation for this event, we were discussing some issues, and for me it's a concern, let's say, the capacity of people at the local level to collect data to inform gender-related disparities at national and subnational levels. It has to do a bit with Subash's question before. because we know that the WEAI requires expertise to design the process, select indicators, collect information, and to interpret the significance of these domains, no, in balance to women's empowerment. So this, probably there is not enough capacity at local level. I am thinking now on the Andean countries, small communities, rural municipalities, that would like to measure as well women's empowerment in their area, but don't have this capacity to apply this specific tool. Not to mention also that they are very much involved in this context. They know their own reality, no? And that's a very big plus. They could know whether women become their autonomy space, maybe from other activities, so they know the context very well. So my question is whether information, there is a talk, whether there is a talk there, whether information collected in national censuses, particularly agricultural censuses, that are accomplished periodically in different countries at both national and subnational level could be somehow combined with local surveys, with women's empowerment indicators as a proxy for women's empowerment. If there is a talk on that, because in that way, also local municipalities and local communities could make use of this more accessible tool probably, and they wouldn't depend necessarily on external expertise, no? Talking about empowerment. So that's my question.
I think that we cannot, people like myself or people who are working in sort of international organizations cannot answer all the questions of, cannot pretend to be able to know all the answers about, women's empowerment on the ground. So I do think that it's important that, there are efforts by grassroots organizations who have, obviously a closer ear to the ground to track empowerment themselves through ways that are meaningful to them. So I know that a lot of NGOs have their own tools for measuring empowerment. And for example, I'm thinking of Oxfam and CARE. They do have their own ways of doing so, and I think it's important to, as you mentioned, use information from agricultural censuses, use information from national surveys, and have them work closely with communities to be able to understand and interpret these measures which are being generated by national statistical systems. I'm not sure that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I have another question which relates to the part of gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. From my research experience on sustainable agriculture practices and seed systems, often in the qualitative research, often the issue of domestic violence turned up, were brought up by the women in the interviews. And that happened in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and it really, really struck me. And there's a report from Oxfam's empowerment projects that showed that even their projects targeted at women empowerment led to women empowerment in many domains, but at the same time, the level of domestic violence has increased. And the WEAI has now a module on intimate partner violence, which I think is great, but I was wondering, it is measuring the attitudes. It's not measuring directly whether women experience violence or not, or whether men hit their women. And I guess there probably is a reason, and I would love you to explain more. Why did you not include direct measurement? Have you maybe tried it, and what are the issues around? Because I guess you're aware about the gap with measuring only the attitudes versus the experience, and I'm just afraid that it might be misleading coming up with the results. So I would love to learn more about your decisions, why it is only about the attitudes.
The simple answer is ethics. You cannot we are actually using the module from the Demographic and Health Surveys, or DHS, because we don't want to ask questions that might endanger the respondent or put the respondent at risk unless we have support provided by the project to address or to help people who are experiencing intimate partner violence. So it's an ethics question, considering that the WEAI or pro-WEAI are being included in surveys which are not about domestic violence interventions primarily. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Great.
I also wanted to answer a question in the chat about whether women's empowerment translates to gender equality. Are they the same measures, or this is a question from Edward Asafo Age, and the answer is that women's empowerment and gender equality are different things, but the information collected in WEAI or pro-WEAI, because they are collected from both men and women, can be used to look at gender equality by comparing the responses of men and women within the same household. So it is one way of measuring gender equality.
Thank you, Dr. Agnes, for those insights. As you mentioned, WEAI is a composite index, and it captures empowerment using different dimensions. But ultimately, we have a single number, which we try to infer out of it. My question is twofold. Like for using it in econometric models as a variable, how good are they? I've seen papers using them. I've seen a lot of your publication using them, but it kind of like it picks, many of them just picks individual variables, individual dimensions into the model, and few just uses the 5-dimension into the models. So how good are they to be used in an econometric model as a variable?
So it depends on what you mean by good. I personally do both. I look at how the aggregate index performs, but I also like to look at how the individual indicators perform, because I'm very interested in understanding what's happening. So it's not like, okay, so people are more empowered. What's actually going on? And we have been using this increasingly in the context of impact evaluations, and it's like in the context of impact evaluations that I'm finding that it does make sense to look at it does make sense to look at the individual indicators, because those are the things which programs can affect directly. They can affect more directly. I'm not sure this answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Agnes.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? What is the name? Libaumo, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. If you're still not able to unmute yourself, please, you can write your question in the chat. Andre, do you have a question?
Can you get me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. I was saying that I'm Bonyini Libamwe from Burkina Faso, and I'm very glad to join this communication. Okay, I have a specific question to Doctor. It is about the choice of the countries to implement, for instance, this women's empowerment. This is my first question. And the second, I want to know the reaction of the financial, the reaction of the financial donors to these women who are involved in these empowerment projects?
The first question, the choice of countries has pretty much been demand-driven. So we don't choose the countries where to implement it. It's basically if donors or governments want it to be implemented, then they implement it and we help them. In the case of WEAI, we opened a call for proposals for projects to join, and so they joined. So there is in fact a project in Burkina Faso. There are 2 projects in Burkina Faso actually that have used it. I wanted to understand what was your question about the reaction of donors to Women's Empowerment Project. What does this question mean? I don't understand it very well.
Okay. What I mean basically is owing to the fact that the women do not have like ownership, they do not have property ownership. Now, how do banks or the other financial systems, how do they react to this specific problem?
So I'm not sure how to answer this question. It's the banks, it's not really a question that's related to women's empowerment. It's more a question about how do you address the lack of collateral that women have, in terms of borrowing money. And I think what NGOs or other organizations have done has been to, promote microfinance or to promote or to have projects which enable women to save. So in fact, some of the projects that I know of in Burkina Faso that have used WEAI are the Grameen Foundation, which has tried to foster women's savings groups and things like that. So I think that there are efforts to provide to make credit more accessible to women that are being implemented on the ground. I think I'll end there.
Okay, thanks for the question. Probably the answer. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And thank you again, the panelists and Dr. Agnes for this session. I'd just like to add from my side that, in addition to whatever, as I said earlier, in addition to, all the things that it has been able to achieve at the project level and in these different countries, I think what WEAI really also did was to at least put this conversation in, development circles, a conversation that, it's important to include women, and especially in these circles because there's so much emphasis on quantifying improvements, whereas sort of, that only reference point or a guide where those of us who are doing quantitative research are able to use that and then convey this in research. Before closing the session, I'd request Professor von Braun, who is joining us online, to make his closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Sundus. Agnes, you must have felt speaking to us is an event for us. So the excitement with which the team at ZEFb prepared for your lecture, you must have felt from the panelists' interventions and so on. So a big thank you up front in my closing remarks. You have, together with your colleagues, Jemima and Ruth and others, shared a very influential paper for the UN Food Systems Summit. We are just putting finishing touches to the volume where all these papers are going to appear in the Springer open access book. That prompts my first substantive additional remark. for the future, maybe a stronger focus on women empowerment in the whole food system, including the value chains, the food processing sectors, in the context of the transformation of the food system. I think this would be great future work. My second remark relates to the dynamics of empowerment or disempowerment of women. Acutely, I think it would be very interesting to see what's happening in the context of the COVID lockdowns in rural areas. So the disruptions which we had, and the current disruptions which we have from the market pressures, the food price crisis. So it's great that you have the market inclusion component strengthened. And we look forward to see the insights from index changes in the context of the current food price crisis. So comparing before and after and with project interventions, which types of interventions work, that would be great. My third point relates to context. The final recommendation in your paper for the UN Food System Summit, the scientific group paper, emphasizes further work on cross-contextual evidence, to come to more generalizable conclusions. Context matters. So systematically looking at context and cross-contextual evidence of what really drives the opportunities for empowerment and or the lack thereof. And in that context, I'm sure racism, discrimination of indigenous peoples, access to education or not, the fast change in peri-urban areas. So I just mentioned a few contexts and a few fundamental drivers would make a lot of sense to me. And as this data set becomes bigger and bigger and has more points in time in it, I think advanced statistical methods, a bit of AI here and there would be encouraging for the research community. In closing, let me say, you need to visit us. You need to spend some days at ZEFb. There is an energetic, enthusiastic group of women and men at ZEFb, and especially of doctoral students and postdocs and so on, who would hugely benefit from your advice. And I'm sure you would enjoy it to enter ZEFb and spend a few days or a week plus. I know your time is short, but please put that on your agenda in the coming months, not to say years. It would be lovely to have you here. Thank you again, and thank you, Sundus and team.
Thank you, Joachim. I would love to visit ZEFb.
Thank you very much, Professor von Braun. Dr. Agnes, would you like to make some closing remarks or say something before we finish?
Sure, I'll be very brief. Thank you so much, ZEFb, for inviting me to talk. I mean, it's really not the same as being there, but I think that I was able to feel some of the excitement, sort of the intellectual vigor of your colleagues and also of everybody joining online. This is really a very ripe, a very fertile field for research, and I will not pretend that we have answered all the questions. In fact, I think that the more we do research, we generate more questions, because empowerment is a dynamic process. And as we continue to get more data and we understand more, we uncover more issues to investigate. So I'm really glad that there's a very active gender research community in Bonn and worldwide. And I'm really pleased to be able to join all of you today. Thanks.